Thanks everyone for tuning in to our presentation on the conservation for Malangatana Mozambique Modern, an exhibition that was held last year at the Art Institute of Chicago. In this first section, I will discuss the planning and work carried out in Mozambique to prepare 10 paintings and 24 drawings for shipment to Chicago. As a brief introduction to the artist, Malangatana Valente Ngwenya is one of the founders of modern African art and arguably the preeminent artist in Mozambique. His unique style often features dense compositions and vibrant colors to depict humans, animals, and supernatural creatures. So the Art Institute was very excited to host the first solo exhibition of this artist at a major museum in the United States. The time frame covered by the exhibition, 1959 through 1975, encompasses the start of Malangatana's career and ends with Mozambique's independence from Portugal. During the planning stages, it became evident that a three-phase approach to conservation was needed. As an overview of these stages, the first phase was the initial trip I took to Mozambique with the three curators, Hendrik Folkarts, Costa Pedritas, and Felicia Mings, and this was to aid in the final selection of the artworks. My role was to examine the artworks and determine what work needed to be done to ensure they could safely be packed, transported, and displayed in the exhibition. During the second phase, I returned to Mozambique to do triage treatments to stabilize the pieces and also to oversee the packing of the works. Finally, once the works were at the Art Institute, I handed them off to literally a whole team of conservators who carried out more in-depth conservation treatments and rehousing to ready the pieces for display. And Allison and Katrina will discuss these last steps in more detail. The artworks examined were housed in two locations central to the artist's life: his home and studio in the capital Maputo, and an cultural center, art center that he built in his home village of Malangatana, which is about 50 kilometers from Maputo. The selection process was not easy given how prolific the artist was. Between Maputo and Malangatana alone, there must be well over 100 artworks stored there, and this includes prints, drawings, sculpture, ceramic, wood carvings. I mean, he really just tried his hand at everything. The photo of his studio that you see here offers just a small snapshot of the artworks housed there. I mean, as you can see, art pretty much just covers every inch of available space. It was fascinating to be in the studio as it's virtually untouched since the artist's death in 2011. Even his easel and painting materials have been left intact, a sampling of which you can see in the right photo. And I relish the chance to be able to study his materials and painting process. After viewing the works in Maputo, the curators and I traveled to the cultural center in Malangatana. Malangatana was actively involved in the design and fabrication of this center, and it was created to be a place for festivals and art education. The image on your screen shows a panoramic view of the central courtyard there, and you can see that he even decorated the walls with his distinctive designs that he carved into the wet cement. The cultural center, however, was never completed and today sits empty except for some artwork that's stored there. Unfortunately, the open environment of the building resulted in the paintings developing some condition issues. The painting at right, titled The 25th of September 2, offers one example. Stored without a frame, the flexible hardboard support had severely warped with time, and there was minor delamination of the hardboard along the edges, along with some paint loss and a very heavy layer of dirt on the surface. Although this slide doesn't necessarily touch upon the conservation side of the project, it does illustrate aspects of the exhibition planning that were unique to me, and I think really to this exhibition. While we were there, the artist family invited us to visit Malangatana's grave, which you can see on the left. And during a ceremony performed at the grave site, his family introduced us to Malangatana and asked him to bless the exhibition. And it was a very profound moment for all of us, and I immediately became emotionally invested in this show. The photo on the right shows perhaps the most beautiful setting you can imagine to plan an exhibition. It speaks to the collaborative nature of this very complex, logistically complicated project. Seated together under the tree are the curators, the artist's sons, an agent for the Family Foundation, and the head of LP Art, a French art shipping company. Since there really aren't any art services in Mozambique or anywhere nearby, we looked into South Africa as well. We contracted LP Art to build the crates in France, ship them to Maputo, and then come down and pack the artworks. 2 months later, I returned to Mozambique to carry out the second phase of conservation, as all of the paintings and drawings that were selected required some amount of treatment prior to shipping. This included superficial cleaning of the artworks to remove dirt, cobwebs, insect parts, and other debris from their surfaces, consolidation of paints and hardboard supports, and ensuring the paintings were securely held in the frames. And this was especially important as some of them were quite literally falling out of their frames. One of the challenges of this trip was making sure I had packed all the equipment, materials that were necessary to carry out these on-site treatments literally halfway around the world. Thinking through the work at hand and deciding what to bring was not easy, as I was limited by what could safely be transported on the plane and by what would fit in my carry-on suitcase, because I knew there was not enough time to risk my suitcase getting lost. Furthermore, the treatment decisions that were made in Mozambique would impact conservation that was undertaken in Chicago. And so all of these factors were definitely taken into consideration. The photo that you see here represents my very efficient and very portable art conservation studio. A few paintings needed more intensive treatment than what I already mentioned. In this case, it consisted of re-adhering lifting paint. The work pictured here is titled Adam and Eve in front of Lorenzo Marcus Cathedral. In this photo, it is on its side, just in case you didn't get that. And the image at right shows the process of gently heating an area that was consolidated with Viva and setting down the lifting paint with a tacking iron. Fortunately, the paint just behaved beautifully. It was flexible enough, and it set down wonderfully. The most physically demanding treatment was the consolidation of the largest painting in the exhibition, which of course just happened to be installed high up on a balcony. The treatment of this 10-foot long painting, sorry, I didn't change that to meters, took 3 days, the whole time balancing on a ladder with my tools. The effort was well worth it, however, to know that the paint was stabilized and that the painting would travel safely. Back in Malangatana for more treatments and back to the 25th of September, I was pleased with how much flexibility the hardboard support had retained. And upon laying it flat to do the treatment, most of the warping that you saw on the previous slide was resolved. Treatment on this piece and 3 other paintings that were housed in Malangatana consisted of consolidating the delaminating hardboard along the edges with PVOH to prohibit further loss. The limited amount of supplies I could bring to Mozambique meant that I had to be resourceful while on site and use materials at hand. In this case, large rocks gathered from outside were utilized as weights during the consolidation process. Working on site always has its challenges, and at no time was this more evident than the day we were packing the paintings and drawings in Maputo. Even with all of our careful planning, and that was months of careful planning, the packing of the works was delayed for 7 hours because we were waiting on customs to release the crates, which, as I mentioned earlier, the crates were built in France and shipped there. And so we were caught in a very long cycle of waiting for customs. And this put an obvious strain on our already very busy schedule. On top of this, the customs agents needed to witness the packing of each and every object. This was an unusual and complicating factor that fortunately proved to be manageable. Everything was finally under control and running smoothly, and then the power went out, something I hadn't encountered before. A brief but torrential rainstorm had knocked out the power. Within seconds, however, enough light was produced courtesy of our phones so that we could continue the work. And it was an intense couple of hours between juggling the needs of some somewhat demanding customs agents, giving on-the-spot training to local art movers who were more accustomed to moving furniture than art. They were just local movers, sorry. And managing a large team who were working as quickly as safely as possible. Additionally, all this was accomplished while trying to communicate in several languages: English, French, Portuguese, a little bit of my very rusty Spanish, and occasionally snippets of Ronga, which is a regional language. All could be heard in the room. Packing in Matalana also posed its own set of challenges. The truck couldn't make it all the way up the driveway because tree branches blocked it. And looking at the photo here, you can just make out the people at the back of the truck there, which is pretty much buried by the tree. And we also discovered that the shipping crates were too large and too heavy to be able to carry across this uneven terrain that you see. And so we had to improvise with the less than ideal packing in the back of the truck on a very warm day. Placed in soft packing, the paintings barely made it out the door, as you can see in the photo at left. And at right, the LP Art and local moving crew are packing in the truck. Despite all the challenges, everything was packed up safely and the crates could begin their long journey to Chicago. Watching the packed truck carefully make its way down the very narrow, very bumpy road in Matalana really drove home how essential it was to have proper crates to protect the artwork. And I was so happy we had gone through the extra work and expense to have these made. At this point, I will pass it over to Katrina.
Thanks, Julie. During the course of the exhibition, we examined 26 paintings on loan to the Art Institute of Chicago using a variety of investigative techniques. While there's a broad range and depth to what could be discussed about the artist's technique, in an interest of time, we will provide a few highlights of this research before getting into the treatment approach for the 10 paintings that arrived from Mozambique. Throughout his career, Malangatana painted on stretched canvas and board. Among the works we studied, all of which date from 1959 to 1975, the period covered by the exhibition, Malangatana Mozambique Modern, only one was completed on canvas, and the others were executed in oil paint on an artist-prepared hardboard support. As you're likely aware, hardboard is a generic term for compressed wood material sold under brand names like the US version Masonite, or in this case, the artist used a local regional brand called Unitex. The hardboard supports have both a smooth burnished side and a rough textured side, which are created during the manufacturing process. Can you go back one slide? Malangatana sometimes used either side of the board. Sorry. The painting visible here is one of the 10 that traveled from Mozambique. It's a work titled Final Judgment, and it was painted on the smooth, burnished side of the hardboard support. Next slide. In this next example, the 1974-75 painting, Remember Those Who Entered Bleeding, the composition was painted on the rough, textured side of the support. Our examinations led us to believe that Malangatana was likely attuned to the textural differences between the sides of the hardboard support and the final effect that it had on his images. In these details here from the two paintings just described, you can see that difference, and I've also provided examples of unpainted hardboard. Anecdotally, we were told that the artist liked to experiment with his materials. It's also possible that the rough side of the support may have offered increased stability because of a greater bond with the artist applied ground and paint layers. Malangatana may have even noticed this practical advantage and gravitated towards it, as it appears that he used the textured side of the board more frequently over time. In the exhibition, we found that all the paintings completed after 1963 were executed on the rough textured side of the hardboard. In many of the paintings that were treated or examined at the Art Institute, including 25th of September that you saw previously, close examination of the work also revealed small holes around the perimeter of the painting. While some accounts have linked these holes to the artist repurposing materials for his painting supports, and even suggesting that the hard boards may have previously been used in shipping crates or containers, we found that the artist's ground did not fill or even partially fill these holes as one might have expected had they been from repurposing. But for our part in the conservation treatment, we stabilized any flaking paint around the holes if it was necessary and determined not to fill them, as the artist had not either, despite having these paintings in his care until his death in 2011. In addition to the examination of the paintings themselves, we were lucky to have some images of the artist's studio and of Malangatana himself working. Though most of these resources documented a period much later in the artist's career, they were often helpful resource nonetheless. In this one example on the screen is a photograph of the artist's studio. One thing we saw in many of the archival images of Malangatana working on paintings and paintings in progress was an abundance of underdrawing on artist-supplied light colored grounds. And at this time, I will turn you back to Julie, who will speak to Malangatana's underdrawing.
Drawing was always an important means of expression for Malangatana. As an artist, he used it for organizing his thoughts, processing his surroundings, and planning his dense, complex compositions. As Katrina said, the exhibition afforded us the opportunity to investigate how Malangatana used preparatory drawings in his paintings. Examination revealed that his underdrawings were executed in a range of media, such as graphite, charcoal, possibly colored pencil, and even paint, and that he frequently used more than one type of media in a single painting. In one such instance, the painting being examined here, The Fountain of Blood from the Cleveland Museum of Art, was extensively sketched in using at least two types of dry media. One of the artist's characteristics attributes is the blurring of distinctions between monsters and humans. An interesting facet of the preliminary drawings in The Fountain of Blood is the way in which Malangatana laid in some of the monstrous figures, sketching them in with more anatomical detail than appears in the simplified final painted image. The style of Malangatana's drawing varies from fairly controlled to boisterous and free-flowing, as seen in this IR detail. The lines were frequently reinforced and reinforced multiple times to adjust and strengthen them. There are also moments where his drawing is so fast and fluid that it appears he drew in a continuous line without even picking up his implement. And a good example of this can be seen in the legs and foot at center. Generally, however, Malangatana used underdrawing as really just a rough guide for his loose style of painting. We did not find any instances where he faithfully followed the sketch lines that he had laid down. And instead, there are frequent small deviations between the lines of the drawn image and the painted one. Changes in individual elements could also occur between planning and painting. One example of a small but notable change can be found in Big Monsters Devouring Small Monsters, where a fantastical creature's horns have been changed into curving antennae. I have to say this is one of our favorite IR details, as the alterations have changed this fanged, horned, terrible creature into a sort of more whimsical one that you see at left. Even more substantial changes occur during the painting of the Dawn. Here, infrared revealed bold lines executed with a confident hand in a wet medium, likely paint. One of the major compositional changes that are noteworthy, for instance, is the fact that the heads of two women on the left, one of which is shown here, were initially drawn with what appears to be traditional headscarves, the fabric implied with the fluid undulating lines that you see near their foreheads. In a poignant transformation, Malangatana recast these female figures as militants and changed this woman's headscarf into a turquoise helmet marked with a small Mozambican flag. And you can also see the outlines of another figure to the left of her that was sketched in but never realized in paint. Now back to you, Katrina.
So based on our examinations and confirmed by archival photos, such as the two shown here, we also learned that in many of his works, Malangatana blocked in his compositions. He applied solid colors shape by shape with very little observable change to these colors. The paints he used were often opaque, probably of a fluid consistency that was well suited for this technique. The paint application was efficient and direct. Malangatana built up the image with just a few layers, and for somebody who once claimed that it was, quote, the whole of Mozambique, from north to south, east to west, the southern Africa that gives me my colors, everything I express in my paintings, end quote. He appears to have used surprisingly few pigments. Next slide. In fact, visual cues from the paintings paired with preliminary analysis with XRF of select paint surfaces conducted by two of our colleagues pictured here, Kim Muir and Clara Granzotto, in the image on the right, suggests that Malangatana achieved his bright and varied paint surfaces with a limited number of primary colored pigments. The analysis of two works, The Final Judgment and Big Monsters Devouring Small Monsters, the latter which is shown here, allude to the presence of similar pigments in these paintings, including Prussian blue, cadmium red, chrome yellow or orange, zinc white, and carbon-based blacks. Importantly, secondary colors such as the greens and purples appear to have been created using mixtures of these pigments, since the elements that might have indicated individual greens or purples were not detected in this analysis. The palette of the artist appears to have widened after he was awarded a grant to study engraving in Lisbon, Portugal in 1971. Initial analysis of The Cry for Freedom, a painting completed shortly after this time abroad, indicates that this palette likely includes some of the same pigments, but with the notable additions of lead white, cadmium yellow, and cerulean blue. Recognizing that only so much information on pigments can be inferred or extrapolated from XRF analysis alone, further analysis of Malangatana's paintings is needed to confirm these preliminary findings. We also believe that still more types of pigments are likely present in this painting, and that the selection of blue pigments in particular appears to have expanded considerably from Malangatana's earlier works. While fairly limited in the pigments used, we observed that the artist employed a variety of techniques of paint application. Pictured here, for example, in some instances, Malangatana included texture within the paint layer using controlled brushstrokes to create a visually activated surface. In this work, Adam and Eve in front of Lorenzo marked Cathedral, small raised C-shaped brushstrokes were applied to an otherwise very smooth surface, and this imparted a scalloped texture in the thicker paint on the snake's body, visible in raking light. Malangatana also created a similar visual and textural interest in some other works, periodically applying small passages of impasto on the whites of creatures' eyes, for example. Next slide. While exploring the versatility of his materials, Malangatana also moved to the other extreme. He thinned his paints considerably to imitate blood and tears running down the surfaces of numerous compositions. Malangatana likely diluted these paints with solvents to a runny, pourable consistency, and after applying it, allowed it to drip down the surface of the work. In the examples visible here, which are taken from 3 different works in the exhibition, you can see how the paint was thinned and allowed to run down the image, pooling or even mixing on the surface. In terms of composition, we did note that even in the short period we studied, the later paintings corresponding to the period after the aforementioned travels abroad became more complex. For example, in the large painting shown here, Cry for Freedom, Malangatana worked in a complex process of overlapping and intertwining figures, and in various areas introducing thin ghostly forms with veils of transparent or translucent paint. Next slide, thank you. You can see this a bit better in the 2 details on the screen of the orange figure on the left, where it's thinly painted on the arms and it becomes some of these other figures' faces, and then in the ghostly white figure on the right. Malangatana also appears to have embraced localized variations in the surface sheen or gloss in some work. This is evidenced by instances where the artist appears to have mixed his paint with medium or varnish, or by selective varnishing after works were complete. Here in the work titled The Dawn, you can see one example of a glossier medium used on the figure's top lip. Finally, we also observed some outliers in our examinations. In this painting, The Tree of Love, for example, paint thickness and texture are paramount. Sharp peaks of thickly applied impasto vibrantly colored the surface, dominating the entire composition in a way that is independent of the imagery. I don't have a detail of that, but you can kind of see that in the image on the left. The two images on the right, the details show areas where the artist's paint continues onto the frame. It indicates that the painting was either completed in the frame or that parts of the painting were finished after the work was framed. In a few minutes, Allison will discuss a bit more about framing, but first I will speak to the treatment of the 10 paintings from Mozambique. We knew from Julie's visit to Maputo and Matalana that in addition to the treatment she completed to prepare the works for travel, all 10 paintings would require some level of conservation treatment or framing work undertaken in our conservation labs once they reached Chicago. After arrival, and once the works were acclimatized to the museum environment, unpacked, and condition checked, we would then need to send the paintings to our imaging lab for before treatment photography. When all was said and done, we were left with just about 10 work weeks in late 2019 and early 2020 to complete the treatment of 10 paintings. This meant a very busy conservation lab and an all hands on deck approach to complete the treatments in time for what at the time we envisioned would be a mid-March opening of the exhibition. You've already met Julie Simek, and soon you will also hear from Allison Langley. In addition to the three of us presenting to you now, paintings conservators Kim Muir, Kelly Keegan, and Elizabeth Wickfield each treated paintings in preparation for the exhibition. While every painting required an individualized approach to treatment, it was largely broken down into three basic steps at the Art Institute: consolidation, cleaning, and in-painting. Much like Julie explained regarding the consolidation required prior to travel, some of the paintings needed additional consolidation and setting down of lifting paint once they reached the conservation lab. This involved the careful use of Viva 371 to secure lifting, detached, or otherwise insecure paint. For the consolidation of flaking paint, I used a previously desiccated Viva, prepared in benzene, and slowly warmed to temperature. During condition checking of this work, The Tree of Love, pictured on the table in our lab, I observed several areas of interlayer cleavage that needed to be addressed. I applied the adhesive with a small watercolor brush, wicking it beneath flaking or lost paint. Using a warmed adhesive allowed better penetration beneath the delicate surface, forming a bond between the paint flake and the lower layer of blue paint visible beneath. Once cool, the area at the base of each lifting paint flake was warmed with hot air, while I simultaneously used a Teflon-tipped clay shaping tool to push the paint back into place. In this case, I was nervous that a flat iron would be more apt to crush the delicate paint flakes on this particular work and wanted to have the most visibility during consolidation. The hot air tool had the advantage of allowing the paint to remain visible at all times, and it worked, and the consolidation was successful. After ensuring that the paint was secure on each of the works, the next step in all the treatments was cleaning. For most of the surface cleaning, my colleagues and I relied on various concentrations of triammonium citrate applied with hand-rolled cotton swabs. In some cases, cleaning involved removing a dark reddish dirt layer, which we strongly suspect accumulated from years of the works being exposed to their natural environment in largely open buildings, like those Julie showed you previously. On initial testing, we quickly realized that there was a lot of variability in the stability of the paint and how easily the dirt would be removed from the surface. In some cases, the paint layer being somewhat sensitive to moisture meant that we had to have expert control over both our solutions and our techniques for grime removal. Next slide, please. On the smooth varnished surface of the final judgment, I was able to remove a gray grime layer with nothing more than saliva and pH-adjusted deionized water. In the during treatment detail presented here, you can see the cleaning line at the center of the image. Other works required a bit more finesse, however, as the textured surface greatly increased retention of surface grime and dirt. This variable changed our approach to cleaning. Coupled with the relative sensitivity of some of the colors to moisture, we could not clean the same section with multiple passes. Instead, cleaning was most successful at higher concentrations of triammonium citrate, cleared with deionized water in one pass and then let to dry. Here are two examples where Allison removed dirt from the textured surface of the 25th of September. The next and final step in many of the treatments was inpainting. Just as Julie and I each spent days examining and consolidating the paint layer on this work, Cry of Freedom, to ensure that all insecurities and fragile areas of the paint layer were carefully adhered and then set into place before and after travel, I spent nearly as long carefully inpainting these small losses associated with past flaking. The team used a variety of materials for inpainting. In this case, I used gambling conservation colors to compensate for losses or distracting damages such as scratches and some limited cracking. In areas where I needed a more solid opaque color, I used a small bit of core watercolors, a highly pigmented aquasol-based watercolor by Golden Paints, which allowed me to achieve the intensity I needed in these areas. Here are just two of the many examples of figures in this large work. On the left of each image set, you can see where the old losses reveal the ground layer beneath, and on the right, the pictures after inpainting was complete. Sorry. And now just a couple before and after glamour shots. In this first example, the removal of the dull gray grime layer from the work titled The Final Judgment revealed not only a much glossier surface sheen overall, but depth and saturation present in the darkest colors, as seen in the after treatment image on the right. And once the gray veil of surface grime was lifted and small blemishes were inpainted. This is the final outcome. The same holds true for the work titled Big Monsters Devouring Small Monsters. In this example treated by Kim Muir, you can see a similar result between the before and after treatment images, where the removal of significant accretions, surface debris, and a heavy grime layer revealed the artist's original vibrant colors and much greater depth and contrast between dark and light. At this point, I will hand you off to Allison Langley, the Director of Paintings and Frames at the Art Institute of Chicago, who will speak on the final steps of this project.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Katrina. Next slide, please. In a final preparatory stage for the exhibition, the paintings conservators and curators worked closely with the frames conservators at the museum, Milan Bobasad, Chris Brooks, and Kirk Vuillamo. They designed new frames and back supports for a number of the Malangatana paintings on loan from Mozambique. Their work not only allowed the paintings to be safely displayed in the exhibition, but will aid the long-term preservation of the artworks, which is the end goal for all of our conservation treatments. 5 paintings arrived from Mozambique unframed and required new frames to be built at the museum. These works either no longer had frames or their frames had proved to be unstable for travel and display, and they needed to be replaced. The unique size and flexibility of each panel varied, requiring custom designs for each painting. One painting, The Scene of the Diviner, required extensive work to its existing frame to make it more stable. The painting has a discernible, irreversible convex warp, causing the panel to protrude out of the frame. Unusually, this painting is on a support consisting of 2 hardboard panels glued together, making the painting very heavy and with little flex or give. The weight of the panel support and the pronounced curvature were causing the painting to separate from the frame. Gaps were visible at the corners and the miters were beginning to split. Other paintings needed various adjustments to the backs of the frames. These frames were structurally stable. Some even had original vertical wood strips nailed to the back for support. However, all needed updated hardware, such as D-rings for hanging and new mending plates to better secure the paintings in the frames. We found the hanging strings on several of the existing frames to be insufficient to safely support the weight of the works. In many cases, the nails intended to hold the panels in the frames had dropped out, causing the paintings to move and shift when handled. In general, the painted hardboard panels were quite large and thick, yet they were also surprisingly flexible. They bend and bow quite easily if not properly supported. During our treatments, we were able to use temporary custom designed support trays made with wood and foam core, which held the large boards in plane and kept the edges protected as we moved them around the studio for cleaning and consolidation. While we had all the paintings in the studio, the frames conservators were able to repair and update the existing frames and to design the new ones. They were able to take detailed measurements of each of the unframed paintings and begin construction in their wood shop while we continued to clean and consolidate the surfaces. It was important for the new frames to be aesthetically linked to the existing frames. Here you see 3 of the original frames. We met with the curators to discuss depth, angle, color, and finish. And as a group, we were able to decide upon a composite style that combined the aesthetic qualities of the older frames without copying one style outright. Here you see 3 of the new frames. The frames were made with mahogany, oiled to resemble the dark grainy finish of the older frames. Each frame has a small rebate lined with silicone release paper in which the panel is supported. We were also careful to keep the edges of the new frames aligned with previous frame markings on the painting so as not to cover signatures or compositional elements. The frames really enhanced the appearance of the paintings. They were the final step in a complex, multi-departmental project that required months of planning, examination, and treatment. Comparing the before treatment photos from Mozambique with the photos of the paintings as they appear now, I hope you can see the remarkable transformation resulting from the treatment and framing. The size and the flexibility of Malangatana's painted panels required inventive structural work to hold the paintings in plane in the frames without restraining them. We know that the panels will be exposed to different climates and environmental conditions in the future, and this will result in the subtle swelling and contraction of the composite materials that make up each work. Our aim was to design a frame package that will accommodate movement of the panels while keeping them protected and stable. The frames conservators designed a flexible wood support grid for the reverse of each painting, made with Sitka spruce, which is an extremely light and flexible wood that does not compress with bending and will move in sync with the paintings, yet still offer support. These grids are glued at the lap joints, but have sliding dovetails at the outer edges. The outer edges are waxed, aiding movement and expansion of the grid with exposure to changes in the environment. The grids are separated from the back of each panel with a poplar strainer that adds strength to the thin mahogany frames. And there are metal spring clips inserted between the strainers and the grids to keep flexible pressure on the whole system. As mentioned previously, the scene of the diviner's frame required retrofitting to keep the warped panel from popping itself out of the frame. For this work, the frame conservators prepared a custom curved inner liner that follows the curvature of the warp, protects the edges of the panel, and closes the gaps between the edges of the painting and the frame. Additionally, a wood back frame was added to the reverse of the frame to increase the depth and to add more structural support. Once we completed the many treatments and framing projects, we were ready to exhibit the artworks. We worked with the curators and the exhibition designer to install the 10 paintings from Mozambique side by side with 16 paintings from other lenders and 24 works on paper, all in our galleries. It's always exciting to see the work safely on the walls, beautifully lit and ready for the public. It was a vastly different viewing experience from our first encounter with the paintings. With dirt removed and the panels stabilized and framed, Malangatana's bright, powerful, and complex compositions are captivating and revelatory. The final step of our 18-month-long enterprise involved sending the paintings home after their long and eventful time at the Art Institute. At the end of the exhibition, we re-examined them, created them, and flew them across the world back to the artist's family. The paintings returned to Malangatana's home and studio in Maputo and the Cultural Center in Matalana, where Julie and the curators first saw them in 2019. The climate and surroundings will be vastly different from Chicago's, but we feel we've done everything we can to send the paintings back healthy and secure. We're indebted to the family for entrusting these works to us, to care for them and to enjoy them. Malangatana was a pioneer of modern African art and remains a beloved and towering figure in Mozambique. His imagination and spirit as a painter have inspired us, and we're pleased to have had the unique role preserving the works and Malangatana's legacy for generations to come. We're delighted to reveal that one painting was acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago for the permanent collection, the 1961 panel Final Judgment. If you'd like to learn more about our work in the exhibition, please look for the upcoming digital exhibition catalog entitled Malangatana Mozambique Modern to be published online this spring. The catalog will feature a conservation essay alongside essays by a number of curatorial colleagues. Thanks for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Do we have any questions? I have two questions. First, why was silicone release paper chosen for in the rebate?
That was in case the panels flexed or swelled with changes in the environment, so that it wouldn't rub against the rebate and abrade the edges of the painting, and it would have a little bit of movement.
Usually we use felt or velvet. So I was curious that you'd used silicone release paper.
Normally we would use felt, but the framers felt like that would just give a little more of a slippery surface, so that if the panels did flex and move, it wouldn't scrape the edges. And they're going back to a very different environment. So we were trying to think of things that might not react poorly with high humidity or might not be eaten by bugs and things that these things are exposed to. So it was kind of our solution at the moment.
Okay. Having worked in India, what about the climate? Yes, what effect did that have?
I can take that one since I was there. It's, as you would expect, it's warm. It can be humid. The spaces, both the home and studio in Maputo and definitely Matalon, are unclimate controlled. So there is definitely damage that's ongoing and occurring from being in these spaces. They have fared pretty well though. There's a few paintings on canvas there, and the hardboard is doing better, as you might expect from the materials. Yeah, and it's kind of is what it is. And so we did everything we could to send them back and preserve them so that they'd be around as long as possible.
Yeah, I will add that that's definitely something that was thought about in every step, knowing the environment that they were going to go to, trying to think about our materials and how they may react to high humidity.
And did you get any problems?
I mean, in terms of
Choice of materials? I mean, you're talking to somebody who was told to go to India to varnish some paintings and was told the Indians don't varnish during whatever the season was. And so I can tell you why they don't varnish, because it just flakes off. Yes.
We decided to use Biva for consolidation, in part because we wanted something that wouldn't be as reactive to changes in humidity. And we have corresponded a lot with the family about kind of future care for the works. They've applied for a grant to find better housing for the works, but we tried to, that's where the frame design was very important to us, to make sure it was something that would allow some flexibility and give, because we know they're going to be exposed to a very different environment. And if they move, we don't want them to crack or break. We want them to maybe not bow like they used to before they were framed, but also be able to sort of move around a little bit in the frames as they get exposed to things. But we're hoping they'll survive a bit longer. I mean, they're in remarkably good condition, considering that they've been kind of in open buildings for a very long time. Really,
Yeah.
It was minor consolidation and a lot of dirt.
Yeah, I can imagine. Which way around should I do this? There are some questions. A question to Julie. What material or piece of equipment do you wish you had taken to Mozambique for phase 2 of the project, treatment on site?
I can't think of anything offhand. I felt really prepared. Luckily there was the 2 months before the first trip and the second trip to just really sit and think about it and, think the treatment forward and backwards and talk to Katrina and Allison about the treatment needs, not only there, but in Chicago. Um, a little more time would have been nice. It was a really tightly packed schedule and intense days of working. But yeah, other than that, I felt fairly prepared with the materials.
How did you get them into your luggage? I mean, how did the airline let you have them in your luggage?
Well, most of it, as I mentioned, I could put in the carry-on case, and that was definitely deliberate. The things like scalpels and I think I had to check the tacking iron and the power converter because of course we operate on a different system, things that might have been a little more suspect, but generally they didn't really bat an eye at most of the stuff.
And any glues and chemicals?
I took a very small amount of Bevo. Luckily, that being concentrated as it is, I could take an extremely small vial of that and a little bit of mineral spirits to be able to thin that down. And that was really liquid-wise all I needed to take. So, and then I did the PVOH. I take a bit of jade with me too, but those were all fairly small, and I could put them in, and just as part of your checked luggage, and they didn't twig on to the fact that they were maybe not completely approved.
Smuggled them in. Peter, by the way, I keep getting notes saying my internet connection is unstable. You may have to take over. Right. I'm wondering about the paint sensitivity. I treated a fountain of blood at the CMA and found that the blues and yellows were sensitive to pH, adjusted water solutions. What kind of sensitivities did you find? And did these sensitivities dictate your in-painting medium and the diluent you used? This from Rachel Childers.
So yeah, as I mentioned, we did find it varied between paintings. So we found especially the ones on the smoother side, and in particular Final Judgment, because it was actually varnished. That was the one with the pH adjusted water, and it cleans easily. I think having that varnish layer in there. And then with some of the other ones, it varied by painting as much as it varied by color. And so I don't know if that was something from the painting's history. It wasn't like we could say all the reds are sensitive on every painting, because that wasn't the case. It really did vary. And then in terms of in painting medium, the Gamblin was nice because it was not sensitive to applying that with isopropanol. And with the core watercolors, you can actually do that in a little bit of ethanol. And so choosing those solvent-based in painting medium, because the surface wasn't sensitive and we didn't have to worry about too much more water going back with those.
Okay, what is the artist's studio now? A museum? Is there a plan for its future?
So currently it's still the home of the family. So there are family, the one son lives there, and until recently the artist's wife lived there. She passed away last fall. And so I had the pleasure of meeting her because I was working in their home essentially. And so it's right now it's still just kind of kept as his studio, hasn't been changed much. There's artwork throughout the house. There's another space in the house that's designed that's actually a gallery for his work. And so they do take occasional appointments to show people through. It's not sort of open as a museum. It's not open to the public, but they're, the amount of artwork they have, this family has, is just remarkable. And you can imagine it's not only a gift, but it's a bit of a burden to try to the responsibility of taking care of this artwork. The artist had wanted a museum to be built, and actually he was hoping it would be out in Matalana. The family has some land out there, and that's where his grave is as well. So that was always his intention, was to have a museum built there. Unfortunately, that was never realized, and I think financially it's a bit complicated right now. And so the family's looking into a number of options of, you know, how to move forward.
Okay. Are the paintings unvarnished? I think we've addressed that. Largely, yes. But one
Largely,
more.
yes. I think Final Judgment seemed to be varnished and others had selective use of varnish or resin. So
And to add to Final Judgment, we believe that it was, if not varnished by the artist, it was still when the painting was in his care that it was varnished. And Julie had spoken to one of the artist's sons who mentioned accounts of Malangatana working with a conservator or a restorer at one point in preparation for an exhibition. So we believe that it was, you know, within his wishes that it was varnished.
Okay. What conservation work was done on the works on paper? Were they all Malangatana's prison drawings? Question mark.
they were the prison drawings and they actually arrived framed, but the frames were fairly rickety. And so we offered to remat and reframe all of the prison drawings. So they all got new archival mats and new frames. I mean, we worked with the family to make sure they approved of the design of the frames, and they sort of mimic exactly what they came in, but they're sort of a newer or sturdier archival version. I think there was very minor treatment done to those. The paper conservators really didn't dive in the way we did, and because they had been stored frames and glazed, they didn't have nearly the condition issues that the paintings did. So basically we just rehoused them and sent them back in archival fittings.
Okay. What is conservation preservation approach in Mozambique? What was with the woods?
I think the question was, what's the conservation approach in Mozambique? You were breaking up a little bit there.
Sorry. Okay. Oh.
Yeah. So it's pretty small. There are no training schools there. There is a training school in South Africa that's a year-long program. And from what we could tell, there's only a handful of conservators or restorers in Mozambique, and that was part of the challenge, and ultimately why I very fortunately got to go on this trip was because there wasn't anybody that we knew of or had the training that we were looking for to do any of the work on site. It's also one of the factors that's complicating the family's drive to care for these artworks, because there's not local people. So now, you know, it's financial and availability in terms of being able to get someone to come in and do it. We're hoping, you know, in time that maybe that'll be a field that grows there. There's definitely a need for it. But for now, that's what it is.
Yeah, we struggled to find local connections in Mozambique and in South Africa. There may be people out there, but we had a hard time. We're just not really networked there.
Okay. Now from Joanna Bernstein, it's not a conservation question, but can you speak a little about the financing for this project? What was the motivation? This is a huge undertaking.
It fell under the exhibition budget. We have a series of exhibitions every 2 years, a modern series at the Art Institute of Chicago that's a funded exhibition program. And so they sort of look at different themes. When they were planning this and we first heard kind of what they were thinking, which was going to Africa and bringing over a bunch of paintings that in conditions that no one was really sure of, there were a lot of discussions about how, you know, should we contract it out? Should we do it ourselves? Like, how do we do this? And it got kind of all rolled together in this sort of big, complicated project. But being part, you know, a lot of our treatments are really based on exhibitions and for exhibitions. And that's how a lot of things get funded, is sort of the pool of money that's dedicated to that. We did try to find, like I said, local conservators, but we kind of realized that it seemed to, ironically, seemed to be simpler to bring them to Chicago and treat them ourselves. And it's kind of a cheaper option, but we don't normally undertake treatments this extensive for exhibitions. But I will say we also got very, involved with the family and kind of the artist and his story. And we really felt, this was the right thing to do for this particular show. We don't normally go to this much work for a small modern series, but we did kind of get pulled in because we felt like it was really an important thing for us to focus on.
Okay. From Rachel Barker. Hi, Rachel. I'm interested to know how the conserved and restored works shown at the Art Institute integrated back into the foundation amongst unconserved work. Do they stand out visually? And how does that affect cohesion of display at the foundation?
So the 10 works from Mozambique were actually shipped back. They all went to Maputo. As far as we are aware, they're all still in the crates. And we've been in discussion with the family and feel that that's a safe option right now. A lot of the display of them was a bit ad hoc before. There isn't sort of, like I said, there's this gallery space, but there are also areas where the paintings are just stacked, on the floor by each other. So it's still something that's in progress with the family. So they really haven't been sort of reintegrated into a display of any sort. And they had hoped that the show would go on to other venues, but then COVID hit and it just became too complicated. So we're not sure if the artist family is maybe exploring that as well, since they're conserved, crated, and ready to go.
Okay. Somebody's asking, could you repeat where the artist sourced his board and its name?
It's called Unitex is the local or the regional brand name. Like we said, in the US, it's Masonite. I think in France, it's like Israel or something. We don't know exactly. There are a lot of holes in the knowledge of the artist, and one of them is where he got his supplies. So the board in particular, we don't know. It is a common building material there, and it was amusing because there's at the end of his neighborhood there is a hardware store, and it had Unitex, as one of the things they were selling. But this is much later in his life, much later than the paintings we studied. There is an account that the art supplies he was able to get from any store that sold educational supplies, and I'll also caveat that the research we've done is really specific to the time period of the exhibition. So I think, as he became more successful and was traveling to Europe quite a bit, the amount of supplies were available to him had probably opened up quite considerably. But we really don't know a lot of specifics of where he got supplies or why he chose, say hardboard over canvas. And a lot of, those kind of details are still, hopefully one day we'll be able to figure those out.
Considering the condition of the hardboards compared to the canvases, you have to wonder if it seems like it's a much sturdier material to paint on for that environment. But we've scoured the literature and we're still piecing together sort of where he got his materials. And
I will put in a plug for our essay. While it is still pieces, we do talk about this and whatever resources we could find in terms of the history and the essays that are out there to kind of put together the facts that we couldn't find by just looking at the works.
Okay. And a final question. Hang on, no, it's not a final question. Was the possibility of glazing the paintings considered with the idea to protect the painting surface once back in Maputo and maybe attempt to create microclimate enclosure? I have a feeling this might be like India when air circulation is everything.
Yeah, it would have been prohibitive in a prohibitive expense, but the size of the paintings are fairly large. So to glaze all of them was something our budget wouldn't have allowed. But I think we were more worried about making an adverse microclimate, something like in India, or a really humid environment where you would kind of set up something that might be more detrimental. These have lived sort of outdoors for most of their existence. So our goal was to make something that would hold them, keep them from cracking and bending, but allow them flexibility. And we also weren't sure if the family could maintain, or, it just seemed like something that wouldn't be appropriate for them. So
yeah, that's a good point, because we didn't know really what their future would be, so if they go back and they're in glazing, they're in glazed, and then these microclimates, is that going to be for 10 years, 20 years? The last time that I think there was an exhibition on them was in the 80s or 90s. So we felt it was a safer option not to have them glazed or sealed, but really, but held nice and supportive in those frames.
Yeah, still air isn't a great idea.
We were worried about mold, and
Yeah.
and a lot of the paintings had sort of popped themselves out of their earlier frames, like some of the ones that came unframed, and some we didn't bring over. Like you could tell that they had bowed and flexed, they had actually sort of like popped out of the frame. So we wanted to make something that would sort of support the panels and make them much easier to handle, but still allow them to move with the shifts in the weather.
Okay. Now, hopefully this is the last question. Based on sensitivity, would you say it was an underbound oil or an acrylic paint? Sorry, what kind of paint did Malangatana use?
We think it's oil. He described his paintings as being an oil. And again, these are before 1975. So there are now acrylics in the studio, but when he started using those, we don't know. But these all, based on the literature and based on how they look and how they behave, we think they are oil. Underbound, and some, again, a little bit had to do with what side of the board he painted on. The ones on the rougher side of the board were more sensitive, but I think perhaps they were more in a more absorbent support. But oil. I'll just add, we had intended to do more technical analysis of the paintings, but due to the shutdowns, we never did really get to do FTIR and kind of confirm that. But
thank you everyone for listening in. I know it's strange to think that it's nighttime for you, and hopefully you've enjoyed your wine and cheese. It's still middle of the day for us, so now we have to go back to work.